Welcome to Deep Sight, viewers. In the last episode, we analyzed the core motivations of the anti-French coalition. Now, let's look back at Napoleon's complete trajectory from his peak to his decline, revisit the classic battles that shaped the course of European history, experience the glory and fall of this legendary emperor, and explore the ultimate outcome of this struggle for European supremacy. The beginning of the peak, the Third Coalition and the Battle of Austerlitz. On August 9, 1805, Britain, Russia, Austria, and other countries formally formed the Third Coalition against France. The Allied forces committed all their resources, totaling over 400,000 troops, including 250,000 Austrian troops, 115,000 Russian troops, and auxiliary forces from countries such as Naples. They also received potential support from Prussia, creating a multi-pronged attack on France. The Austrian army was divided into three columns, operating in a coordinated manner. Archduke Charles commanded the main force to attack northern Italy, tying down French forces. Archduke Ferdinand and Karl Marx commanded a second column, joining forces with the Russian army to invade southern Germany, advancing towards the French border. Reserves were deployed in Tyrol, ready to reinforce both battlefields, forming a pincer movement. The Russian army advanced in three phases. Mikhail Kutuzov commanded the first phase, coordinating with the Austrian army to invade southern Germany and launch the initial offensive. Lewin Bennigsen commanded the second phase, following up to consolidate the front lines. Ivan Michelson commanded the third phase, stationed on the Lithuanian-Prussian border, ready to reinforce the front. In addition, the Allied forces dispatched expeditionary forces to Naples and Stralsund, further expanding the siege and attempting to encircle and annihilate the French army. Napoleon astutely perceived the weaknesses in the Allied forces' deployment and their offensive intentions. Understanding the importance of a preemptive strike, he decided to launch a preemptive attack before the Allied forces could fully assemble, aiming to defeat the Austrian army and break the Allied siege before the Russian army reached Central Europe. From August 25th to 26th, Napoleon personally instructed Berthier to issue marching orders to the Grand Army. The French army rapidly marched from its coastal camp to the Rhine, quickly completing its assembly and deployment. The 2nd Corps of Marmont, the 3rd Corps of Davout, the 4th Corps of Soult, the 5th Corps of Lens, and the 6th Corps of Ney formed the main force, advancing rapidly towards the Rhine, ready to cross the river at any time. The 1st Corps of Bernadotte was stationed in Hanover, responsible for containing the enemy's flank and preventing surprise attacks. The 7th Corps of Augereau served as a reserve, stationed in the rear, ready to support the front lines and fill gaps in the battlefield. On September 10th, Karl Marx led the Austrian army into Bavaria, establishing a camp in the Ulm region to await Russian reinforcements. His plan was to leverage the fortified positions to join forces with the Russians before launching a general offensive against the French. This decision, however, sowed the seeds of the Austrian army's eventual annihilation. On September 25th, with the exception of Bernadotte's 1st Army and Augereau's 7th Army, the main French forces had reached the Rhine River line, completing their operational assembly. Subsequently, from September 26th to October 2nd, the French army crossed the Rhine in multiple columns, rapidly advancing towards the Danube, gradually encircling the Austrian forces in Ulm. On October 3rd, the French right wing, Ranner's 5th Corps, Ney's 6th Corps, the Imperial Guard, and Murat's Reserve Cavalry Corps arrived at the Ludwigsburg and Stuttgart front, constructing a defensive line. The center, Soult's 4th Corps and Davout's 3rd Corps, advanced towards Hall and Ingelfingen, cutting off Austrian reinforcements. The left wing, Bernadotte's 1st Corps, Marmont's 2nd Corps, and the Bavarian army, crossed Prussian territory, reaching Würzburg, forming a left wing. Pincer movement. The French army, as a whole, rotated clockwise, gradually deploying along a line parallel to the Danube, preparing to encircle and annihilate the Austrian forces in Ulm from the north and east. On October 7th, the French launched a fierce attack on Donauwörth on the Danube. Soult's, Lanner's, and Murat's armies began crossing the Danube east of Ulm, completely cutting off the Austrian army's eastward retreat route and trapping them in the Ulm region. On October 8th, Murat led his cavalry to encounter the Austrian army at Weltingen, engaging in fierce fighting. Utilizing flexible tactics and a powerful charge, he routed 6,000 Austrians, achieving his first victory and greatly boosting French morale. On October 9th, Soult's army pursued their victory, capturing Augsburg and Landsberg, completely cutting off the Austrian army's eastward retreat and isolating them. Ney's army defeated the Austrians at Ginsburg, establishing a solid position on the south bank of the Danube, further restricting the Austrian army's operational space. Simultaneously, the armies of Bernadotte, Marmont, Davout, and the Bavarian army crossed the Danube around Ingolstadt, constructing a defensive line to prevent Russian reinforcements from the west, thus completely cutting off the Austrian army's external support. Upon learning that their eastward retreat route was cut off and external support blocked, Austrian commander Karl Marx, realizing they were in dire straits, decided to lead his army across the north bank of the Danube in a forced breakout to seek a glimmer of hope. On October 11th, 23,000 Austrian troops launched a fierce attack on the DuPont division stationed between Hasloch and Jungingen on the north bank of the Danube. The DuPont division, however, numbered only about 4,000 men, a stark disparity in strength. Despite this disparity, the French resisted fiercely, holding firm to their fortified positions and displaying unwavering fighting spirit. After suffering heavy casualties, the Austrians were unable to break through the French lines and were forced to retreat to Ulm, their breakout attempt failing. On October 13th, Soult's army outflanked the French at Memmingen, cutting off the last Austrian retreat route to Tyrol and completely sealing off any possibility of escape. Karl Marx attempted another breakout, ordering two Austrian armies to move north to the north bank of the Danube, but they were routed by Ney's army at Urchingen. One Austrian force was forced to retreat to Ulm, while the other fled north, ultimately being annihilated by French cavalry. The Austrian breakout attempt was thus completely thwarted. On October 15th, the French forces completed the encirclement of Ulm, completely trapping the Austrian army and leaving them with no way to escape. With no other option, Karl Marx knew that continued resistance would only result in greater casualties, and was forced to surrender with his army on October 19th. In this battle, the Austrian army entering Bavaria suffered over 60,000 casualties. Only Kimmel's army escaped heavy losses and successfully broke out. The victory at Ulm became a classic example of encirclement warfare in Napoleon's military career, marking the initial setback of the Third Coalition's offensive and officially propelling Napoleon's path to hegemony towards its peak. 1. The March on Vienna and the decisive Battle of Austerlitz. After the victory at Ulm, Napoleon did not stop his expansionist advance. Instead, he immediately adjusted his deployment, concentrated his forces, and prepared to pursue Kutuzov's Russo-Austrian army eastward, aiming to completely crush the main force of the anti-French coalition. Meanwhile, he ordered Ney's 6th Army and Augereau's 7th Army, which had just arrived at the front, to sweep away the remaining Austrian forces around Ulm, consolidate rear positions, prevent surprise attacks by the remaining enemy troops, and ensure the supply and safety of the frontline troops. On October 26th, Kutuzov led the Russo-Austrian forces in a retreat from Braunau to East Wales, where they met up with Austrian reinforcements. Kutuzov attempted to use his numerical superiority to delay the French pursuit, waiting for more reinforcements to arrive before engaging the French in a decisive battle. On October 30th, the French vanguard encountered the Austrian rearguard at Ried, engaging in fierce fighting. The French, with high morale and flexible tactics, defeated the Austrian rearguard and pursued their advantage. The following day, the French again routed another rearguard at Lambach, relentlessly pursuing the Allied forces without giving them any respite, relentlessly pursuing the main Allied force. On November 4th, the Russo-Austrian Allied forces retreated to the east bank of the Enns River, attempting to use the river's natural defenses to construct a defensive line, delay the French offensive, and buy themselves some breathing room. On November 5th, Davout's army launched a fierce attack on the Allied forces stationed at Steyr. With superior firepower and tenacious offensive, they successfully captured the Enns River Bridge, broke through the Allied lines, and continued their eastward pursuit. Upon learning that Kutuzov was leading the Allied forces in a continued eastward retreat, Napoleon immediately ordered his main force to pursue them relentlessly, giving the Allies no chance to regroup or rest. Simultaneously, he appointed Marshal Mortier to command the newly formed 8th Army, which would maneuver north of the Danube to outflank the Allied forces, attempting to cut off their retreat and annihilate them. Subsequently, the French vanguard engaged the Allied rearguard in fierce fighting at Amstetten. Although the Allies fought desperately and successfully slowed the French pursuit, they were unable to shake off the French entanglement, suffering increasing casualties and a continuous retreat of their lines. On November 9th, Kutuzov realized that he could no longer resist the fierce French offensive to the west, and that continuing to hold out would only lead to encirclement and annihilation. Therefore, he decided to lead the Allied forces through Krems to the north bank of the Danube, simultaneously ordering the burning of the bridges to prevent the French pursuit from the south bank. He also proactively abandoned the defense of Vienna, concentrating his forces to prepare for a protracted war with the French. On November 11th, Kutuzov led the Allied forces in a fierce attack on the isolated French 8th Army on the north bank. Despite being far outnumbered by the Allied forces, the 8th Army tenaciously defended its position, resisting fiercely until it successfully withdrew to the south bank of the Danube, where it joined the main French forces, thus avoiding encirclement and annihilation. On November 13th, Murat and Lannes cleverly used deception to trick the Allied bridge-guarding troops and seized the Tabor Bridge, which was supposed to be destroyed by the Allies. Taking advantage of the situation, the main French force stormed Vienna, seizing control of the Austrian capital. Using the undamaged bridges, they rapidly advanced to the north bank of the Danube, continuing their pursuit of the Allied forces. Murat subsequently caught up with the rearguard led by Russian General Bagration, but was deceived by Bagration's feigned peace talks, missing the opportunity to annihilate the Allied rearguard. This allowed the Russo-Austrian forces to continue their retreat towards Moravia, successfully escaping the French encirclement. Upon learning of this, Napoleon severely reprimanded Murat for his mistake. Murat immediately led his army in a full-scale pursuit, inflicting heavy losses on the Russian rearguard. However, the main Allied force had already successfully withdrawn, missing the best opportunity to annihilate them. On November 20th, Napoleon arrived in Braun, beginning to deploy his bases and amass troops, preparing for a decisive battle with the Russo-Austrian forces to completely crush the main force of the anti-French coalition. The Battle of Austerlitz, December 2nd, 1805. The legend of the Battle of the Three Emperors, the strategic situation at this time remained unfavorable to the French. Kutuzov's Russo-Austrian army, having received substantial reinforcements, reached 90,000 men, with another 30,000 reinforcements expected to arrive by the end of the year, continuously strengthening its forces. On the Austrian side, in addition to Archduke Charles's 90,000 troops transferred from northern Italy to the vicinity of Vienna, ready to reinforce the Allied forces, Archduke Ferdinand's 10,000 troops were deployed in Bohemia, tying down the French forces. More importantly, Tsar Alexander I and King Frederick William III of Prussia signed the Treaty of Potsdam, with Prussia promising to formally join the anti-French coalition if mediation of the Franco-Russian conflict failed, and to send up to 100,000 fresh troops to support the coalition. At that point, the French army would face a predicament of being attacked from both sides. At this time, the French army deployed between Kutuzov's forces and Grand Duke Karl's forces numbered less than 100,000, a significant numerical disadvantage. Soult's 4th Corps, Lannes' 5th Corps, the Imperial Guard, and auxiliary cavalry, totaling approximately 50,000 men, were stationed in Brunn, forming the core defensive line. Davout's 3rd Corps, Malka's 8th Corps, and auxiliary cavalry, also totaling approximately 50,000 men, were deployed around Vienna, consolidating the rear, and ready to reinforce the front. Faced with this dire situation of overwhelming numerical superiority, Napoleon displayed extraordinary military strategy and command, accurately predicting the Allied offensive route and devising a meticulous counterplan, intending to lure the enemy deep into his territory and annihilate the Allied forces at Austerlitz. The French army was deployed as follows. To the northeast, Murat's cavalry corps was deployed in 3 columns along the road from Olomouc to Brunn, forming layers of defense. 2 light cavalry brigades were stationed at Weissau, 1 dragoon division at Rochnitz, and 2 heavy cavalry divisions at Solitz, ready to respond to any Allied attack. Soult's 4th Corps occupied the Pratzen Heights, the core high ground of the entire battlefield, controlling the initiative. Lannes' 5th Corps, Udino's Grenadier Division, and the Imperial Guard were stationed around Brunn as reserves, ready to support the front lines. To the northwest, Bernadotte's 1st Corps was deployed in 2 columns at Budweis, with Bavarian and French troops stationed at Igrau, controlling the road to the Danube and tying down Archduke Ferdinand's Bohemian forces, preventing them from reinforcing the main Allied forces to the south. Davout's Third Corps was dispersed, occupying key points between Brunn and Vienna, constructing supply lines and reinforcement routes, ready to reinforce the front lines. On November 28th, the vanguard of the Russo-Austrian Allied forces clashed with French cavalry. After fierce fighting, the Allied forces successfully captured Wischau, greatly boosting their morale and strengthening their resolve to launch an offensive, believing the French army to be demoralized and vulnerable. At 4 p.m. that afternoon, upon learning of the Allied capture of Wischau, Napoleon immediately issued orders to Bernadotte, Davout, and the cavalry commander at 7 p.m., ordering the vanguard cavalry to withdraw. Soult's army abandoned the Pratzen Heights and retreated behind the Goldbach Creek, deliberately feigning weakness to lure the Allied forces into a French ambush. Subsequently, Napoleon dispatched his envoy, Savary, to request a meeting with Tsar Alexander I, creating the illusion that the French army had no intention of a decisive battle and desired peace talks. When the Tsar's envoy, Prince Dolgorukov, arrived, Napoleon deliberately ordered his troops to feign chaos and low morale, further misleading the Allied forces and making them believe the French were incapable of resistance. This fostered greater complacency and created conditions for the subsequent encirclement and annihilation plan. On December 1st, the Russo-Austrian army passed through the village of Austerlitz and successfully climbed the Pratzen Heights, where the French had withdrawn. The Allied commanders became even more complacent, believing the French had completely lost their will to fight and were incapable of resisting the Allied attack. They decided to launch a general offensive the following day to utterly defeat the French and end the war. However, Napoleon had already laid a trap, deliberately withdrawing from the Pratzen Heights and excessively extending his right flank to lure the main Allied force into attacking the French right flank. He then seized the opportunity to recapture the Pratzen Heights, dividing and encircling the Allied forces and annihilating them one by one. At 6 a.m. on December 2nd, all French units were in their designated combat positions, completing their deployment. On the northern flank, Lannes's army was stationed at the Santon Mountains, constructing a defensive line to contain the Allied forces on the northern flank. In the center, Soult's army was deployed between the villages of Gilzikowitz and Pontovix, ready to recapture the Pratzen Heights. On the southern flank, Legrand's division was stationed on a 5-kilometer-wide front at the Goldbach Creek, deliberately feigning weakness to lure the main Allied force into an attack. In the rear, Bernadotte's army served as a reserve, ready to support the front line. Murat's reserve cavalry was responsible for filling the gap between Lannes's and Soult's armies, preventing the Allies from breaking through the French lines. Oudenot's Grenadier Division and the Imperial Guard were deployed around the Chulin Mountains, where Napoleon's headquarters were located, to protect Napoleon's safety and be ready to engage in the decisive battle. Davout's army rushed to the battlefield to support Legrand's division on the southern flank and counter the main Allied attack. At 7 a.m. that day, the Russo-Austrian Allied forces descended from the Pratzen Heights and launched a full-scale attack on the French army, officially beginning the Battle of Austerlitz. This classic battle, later known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, with Napoleon, Tsar Alexander I, and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II all personally present, thus began and became a pivotal battle determining the course of European history. Battle progress. Encirclement on three sides. Allied defeat. 1. Southern Front. The Allied vanguard, Kimmel's troops, launched the first attack on the village of Turnitz. Fierce street fighting ensued within the village, with exceptionally brutal conditions. Leveraging its numerical superiority, the Allied forces launched successive attacks and successfully captured the village of Turnitz at 9 a.m., breaking through the first line of defense on the French southern flank. Simultaneously, another Allied force launched an attack on the village of Sokolnitz and Sokolnitz Castle, slightly to the north, capturing both locations by 9 a.m. and controlling the crucial crossing point at the Goldbach Creek on the southern flank. It seemed poised to break through the French southern defenses and penetrate deep into French territory. At this critical moment, Davout's Friant Division and Bourgessier Cavalry Division arrived on the battlefield in time, advancing towards Turnitz. The Allied forces in the villages of CZ and Sokolnitz launched a fierce counterattack. The French army, with high morale and a swift offensive, caught the Allied forces off guard. They were forced to halt their river crossing and retreat to the east bank of the Goldbach Creek, abandoning the positions they had captured. In this battle, Only 9,000 French troops successfully tied down nearly 40,000 Russo-Austrian troops, buying valuable time for the main French force to regroup and launch a counterattack, becoming a crucial turning point in the campaign. 2. Central battlefield. Napoleon personally observed the movements of the Allied forces on the Pratzen Heights from the Chulon Mountains, controlling the overall situation. As the fog gradually dissipated, seeing that the main Allied force had been committed to the southern flank attack and that the Pratzen Heights were poorly defended and weakly manned, Napoleon immediately ordered Marshal Soult to lead the Central Army in a fierce attack on the Pratzen Heights, recapturing this key high ground. Upon receiving orders, Soult immediately directed his Saint-Hilaire and Vendôme divisions. Saint-Hilaire attacked the Pratzen Castle southwest of the Pratzen Heights, while Vendôme attacked the old vineyards northeast of the heights. The French soldiers, with high morale and a swift offensive, quickly captured key positions on the Pratzen Heights, gradually gaining control of the area. The Allied forces, upon learning of the French capture of the Pratzen Heights, were alarmed. Knowing that the loss of the heights would divide their lines and leave them vulnerable to attacks from both sides, they hastily mobilized reserves to attempt to recapture this crucial high ground. A fierce tug-of-war ensued on the Pratzen Heights, with heavy casualties on both sides. During the 2-hour battle, the Allied forces launched several counterattacks, all of which were repelled, and they were unable to retake the heights. Ultimately, Soult's army successfully broke through the center of the Allied lines, completely separating the northern and southern flanks. The Allied forces were caught in a predicament, unable to support both ends, and their lines began to collapse. 3. Northern Front. At dawn, French and Allied cavalry engaged in fierce fighting around the Sannon Mountains. Both sides suffered casualties and reached a stalemate, neither able to break through the other's lines. Afternoon. As the situation in the central battlefield gradually became clearer, French morale soared. They began to adjust their tactics, with infantry and cavalry coordinating their attacks to launch a full-scale counterattack against the Allied forces. The Allied morale was already low, and facing the fierce French offensive, they could no longer mount an effective resistance. They began to retreat in disarray, with soldiers deserting en masse, and the lines completely collapsed. In the final stage of the battle, Soult's army launched a fierce attack from the Pratzen Heights down towards the Russo-Austrian Allied forces on the southern flank, creating a pincer movement. The Allied forces, now facing off against Davout's army, were attacked from both sides and completely collapsed. Soldiers laid down their weapons, either fighting to the death or surrendering, creating chaos on the battlefield. Some Allied soldiers attempted to break out across the frozen Saxon Lake, but due to the thin ice, they fell into the lake and drowned or were annihilated by the French. The remaining Allied soldiers either died in battle or surrendered, completely losing their ability to resist. At 5 p.m. that day, the battle officially ended. The Battle of Austerlitz ended in a complete French victory, a classic battle that became the pinnacle of Napoleon's military career. Impact of the battle: reshaping the European landscape, Napoleon reaching his peak. The victory at the Battle of Austerlitz had a profound impact on European history, completely reshaping the political landscape of the European continent. On December 4th, Napoleon and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II signed an armistice, ending their hostile relationship. On December 26th, the two sides formally signed the Treaty of Pressburg. The Austrian Empire paid a heavy price, paying huge war reparations, ceding Veneto and Tyrol, and completely relinquishing its influence in Central Europe, becoming a second-rate European power. The signing of the Treaty of Pressburg led to a significant expansion of the territory and further strengthening of the Kingdom of Italy, a vassal state of France. The Holy Roman Empire, due to this defeat, became a mere shell, completely losing its control over European countries. The Holy Roman Empire, which had ruled Europe for nearly 1,000 years, was nearing its end. In July 1806, Napoleon formally ordered the formation of the Confederation of the Rhine, bringing several states in the German region under the direct control of the French Empire. At this point, Napoleon's hegemony reached its first peak. The French Empire became the absolute hegemon of the European continent, and Napoleon himself became the true master of Europe. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. I'm your time navigator, Lawrence. Let's explore the truth of history together. Learning from others helps us understand our own mistakes, and learning from history helps us understand the rise and fall of dynasties. I hope today's sharing will give you a new understanding of Napoleon's life. Let's work together for world civilization and peace. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with more history enthusiasts. In the next episode, we will explore how the French Revolution reshaped the modern world. Stay tuned.